the Pledge of Allegiance, and I am the star student tonight who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So everybody please stand and join me. Muted. Okay. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America
and to the
republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
with liberty
and justice
for all.
Good job, President Donnelly.
Yes, I remembered it this time. Only been saying it for wow, 55 years. Let's see, roll call.
Trustee Rodriguez,
Here.
Trustee Jackson Miller,
Here.
Trustee Izan Gonzalez,
Here.
Trustee Friedman,
Present.
Trustee Donnelly.
Present.
Thank you.
Is there a motion to adopt the agenda as it stands?
I'll make the motion. Carolyn.
Carolyn first, Amanda second.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any public communications that is not regarding the agenda item?
I don't have anything on text.
Nothing on email.
No one on Zoom.
Very good. Well, let's move right along and we'll turn it over to Scott first.
Very quickly, yep, I'll just welcome everybody. Thank you for giving up some of your time to work on this most important topic of racial equity that we've been engaged in all year. Our task force met recently, our administrative council met recently, so we're all working on the work together, and just very excited to continue it tonight with Nicole Anderson. Welcome, Nicole, and I'll pass
Hello.
the virtual mic over to you. Still no audio.
Always do a cue card.
While Nicole works with that, I'll just tell you a little bit about what's going on with the task force. I think most of you know. If I remember right from the last one, because we share one seat, it was Amanda and Carolyn at the last Racial Justice Task Force, and they're really buckled down into their subcommittees now. We did a little bit of work around responding to folks who maybe have differing views in our community and how to be prepared to respond to folks and also, you know, engage them in a positive way. So I thought that was very helpful. And then majority of the time was really afforded to the subcommittees who are digging into data and really working on that equity action plan. So that's where the task force is, and it's going to be exciting to see where they end up. They're meeting in between their scheduled meetings to continue that work.
Okay. All right. Nicole.
I think she's still fiddling.
No, did you already reboot? Did you log off and log back on?
She did.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Let me do the phone thing. Okay, sounds good. Oh, let's see that number. Yes, I never used that, but that always pops up. So get the phone option.
just sing the song, Tommy Two Tone.
George, do you have the phone number associated with the Zoom?
I'm looking for it now.
Okay, thanks.
Is it the 200-3546 number? It says during the meeting. Oh, that's public. Oh, never mind. That's public comment.
You know how whenever you get a Zoom link, you get that telephone number associated with it, and I hardly ever use it. I don't know if I've ever used it. So, but we need it now.
Let's see.
And Nicole, I just threw the whole invitation in the chat there, so it's on there.
Thanks, George.
Amanda, I loved your puppy on the employee appreciation video that you did. So sweet.
He wouldn't leave me alone. I like moved to 3 different places trying to record my video, and and actually it is Toby's birthday today. So Toby the Wonder Dog is theoretically around 11 today, so we celebrated. It was his gotcha day, so we adopted him 11 years. No, we adopted him 9 years ago. 9 years ago, and we assumed he was 2. So thanks for
awesome.
thanks for that.
While we get that up, I'm also going to put in a link where you can see our current board policy on equity, because it's going to be part of our work tonight.
Okay.
So let's see, SUESD current, and it's the same as what is currently the CSBA sample. So when we adopted it as is. Just FYI. Figure we'll get some of this kind of stuff done now. I emailed it to you too if you want to see it. Just
Oh, you mean, okay.
Same thing, just 2 different ways to access it.
I see a phone number calling in, but it's oh, now it's unmuted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
What's going on?
Oh,
Yes, I can hear you.
no feedback. No feedback.
No, it's
Okay.
good. We got 2 Nicoles for the price of 1.
Right, isn't that great? I don't know what happened, but we're just gonna roll with it. So hi everybody.
Hello.
That's what I was trying to say. Good to see you all again. Kind of a bittersweet moment of our 4th of 4 study sessions this year. It feels like it went really fast, but I think we have some really important work to do tonight. We only have 2 hours, of course, so it'll be pretty. It'll go pretty quick. So I'm gonna, jump right into it with your permission, and want to just ask. So, how are you doing? I think that's important. Are you doing all right? You're on the home stretch.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we're doing fine.
Okay.
There we go.
We got 88%
All
of
right.
students back in person, so we're doing good.
On your way. That's powerful. Okay. Good. So what I want to do is, this is your study session time. So I always want to, remind you of that. I always say sit back and relax, because this is your study session time for you to learn together, grow together, and discuss, right? You're not taking any action tonight, but you are, I'm going to walk you through a couple of things that can help you think about some of the action you want to take moving forward. So as Scott shared earlier, your amazing racial justice task force has been working hard at getting to their kind of final product, to give you recommendations about 3 focus areas that could really align with the work you want to do as a board. And we'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. And so part of what we'll do today really couples with the work they're doing. So I always want you to see that these things work together. It's not some separate effort. They are really supporting the work of creating a plan to address racial equity gaps. And you as a board, of course, operate at the policy level. So you have a policy that we want to kind of revisit that you've already adopted. And then also think about, what does racial equity mean to us as a board, so that we can have a statement, right? An official statement that will go into your policy. That's really what we're going to do tonight. Okay, sound all right? Great. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen and hope that works. Let me, all right, there we go. So let me get back there. All right. So I have permission to share. Awesome. All right. So just real quick, want to remember our 4 agreements. We're still all good with those. Yes. Okay. Always important to remember, this is our study session time, but we want to push ourselves to grow, and discomfort is required to do racial equity work. So it's often important, again, to have your agreements intact. And so remember, you also work together all year long. So it's really good to have some agreements, because this work's going to get harder and messier as you continue to go deeper. So really important that you continue to have some common agreements about how you're going to work together. And these are always ones I think are really helpful. So I'm going to jump right in and kind of help you kind of see what we're doing tonight, just to make sure that you kind of see how this is all meshing together. Since we saw each other last, I mean, you all have slept. There's a lot that's gone on, and so it's nice to recenter. So the work we're going to do tonight is really, again, around kind of the why of your work. Okay, so you're going to continue to develop that equity statement with the racial kind of lens to it. And that's the why of your work, right? Like as a governance team, what is our purpose or why? It's really what we say equity is to us. And so that's what we're going to work on tonight. Whenever you're stuck and you're not sure about like kind of what I say, the messiness, and we're not sure what direction we're going, there's lots of different initiatives, the winds are blowing, you know, sometimes you got to go back to your why. And as governance team, this is really important when we do racial equity work. So I want you to remember, what is our why? When we're stuck, just pull out your equity statement. And it always helps you get regrounded. The how of the work for you as a governance team is always going to be at that 30,000 foot level. Remember, you don't implement the work. You simply, have the vision for the work. You set policy for the work. But ultimately, there's a process for that. And your norms, your protocols, your role as a board, the practices you have as a board, often when you're not sure, when you get stuck, go back to your handbook. You know, I was kind of joke with you all about when's the last time you looked at your handbook, right? Your handbook is a great guide for when we get stuck in doing this type of work. And I'm going to say you're going to get stuck. You're going to have moments of time when you're not sure what decision to make because you're going to have different voices that are very loud about what they believe or don't believe. And so you always want to just kind of reground yourself and go back to your handbook. Like, how do we engage in this work as a board? Knowing our role, because our role is not to play Scott's role. Our role is to play the board's role. And so you'll find you're going to want to kind of get in the weeds at times. You're going to want to really do things that are in the name of equity. That's very normal for boards. But remember, we want to go back to our handbook, which often reminds us of our norms, our protocols, our roles. And then, of course, what of your work? What's the outcome of all of this, right? You have a policy that you already have established. And we're going to dust that off today and make it become like the realness of our work. But the what of your work also is going to be the priorities. So what are those things that we're going to focus on where we want to see those gaps closed? And those are going to be rooted in priority. And so that's why it's also important to know, what is the result? Where are we going? Like, we want to close gaps based on what we prioritize in our policy. Okay, so it's always good. This slide's really helpful just to remember, why are we here? What are we doing? How are we doing it? Okay, just recentering. So before we jump into your racial equity statement, I want to make sure we just revisit context about what racial equity is. This is really important because do you remember we read that Dr. Paul Gorski article? Do you remember that? And he called it Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. And in that article, he talked about some of the ways like how we may stereotype kids, or we may have kind of this way of kind of, in the name of equity, will still perpetuate inequities, right? And so one thing that's important as you all develop your statement and you focus more deeply on race, we want to make sure that we understand like what race means. Okay, what does race actually mean? And I call it like deconstruct it. And so when you're deconstructing, you look at the definition, you see that it's pointing out a social construct, right? Or sometimes we'll call it a mental construct. Ways that people are divided artificially into like categories so that we can like treat one a certain way, another one a certain way. And that's kind of the historical definition of race, right? Like our racism we see today may not necessarily be what we think applies to today's society. But remember, the history of race had a political need at a certain time. And so we have to remember that in itself is going to be something that we're going to have to deconstruct. So here we are, 2021, you all use data in your district, right? When the staff comes to you, you have data broken down by race and ethnicity. And it's important to recognize that those few boxes that you see in front of you as a board are based on race. And so remember, there are other boxes that people could mark if we allow that, right? But we only allow so many boxes. And so again, race is about assigning a certain category to people. And that's based on history. Okay, now some people would say, well, race is not a real thing, right? That's what some people would say. If that's the case, is that even a real thing? You're just assigning me based on categorizing, and that's a historical phenomenon. But then look at the definition of ethnicity. A little bit different, right? Ethnicity is more about like where I'm from, right? What is my ancestry? What are my cultural kind of characteristics that associate like my language, my belief systems? All those things kind of boil down to where I'm from, my nationality. which is a little bit more about like truth, right? Our DNA. I don't know how many of you have done like, you know, your kind of ancestry.com experience, but you'll notice like DNA is actually like each individual is maybe less than a percentage different from each other, right? And so when we look at that, race and ethnicity really are different things, right? One's a category of people, and one is like, here's our actual shared kind of ethnic and ancestral connection. So we're really have more in common than not. But then here's what I love, and this is what I hope you as a board will start to look at. How do we deconstruct the boxes we put kids and families in based on race and ethnicity and actually break it down to what cultural identity is? And that's when we talk about people who belong to a social cultural group and they have their own kind of self-perception. They identify themselves. So I want to give you an example. I just finished talking to a group of kids. We did a listening session. And I asked them, what is your cultural ethnic identity? Some of them chose to put their ethnicity. Some of them chose to put like how they identify based on sexual orientation or based on language or based on what they're interested in. Now, isn't that interesting? Because now I have to look at kids based on who they see themselves as versus what boxes we put them in. And remember, race is associated with bias, right? So what is bias? Those blind spots, those ways that we actually associate with stereotypes about groups of people based on race, that box we've been put in. And so when we talk about as a board, you're going to create a racial equity statement. And so what we want to do is really think about how are we going to deconstruct what race means so that we don't perpetuate what race has actually done, which is put our kids, our families in boxes, and then we end up not serving them the way that they need because we make assumptions about what that means. So I'm going to give you an example. If I came to you today and I was on Scott's cabinet and I came in and I said, hey, board, we're going to look at some, discipline data, right? Let's look at discipline data. And I'm going to give you the, what is it, 8? Is it 8 or 9 categories, Scott, of race? I think there's only so many boxes kids can mark, right? So I come and I say, hey, board, look at this data. Here's kids, and we see this disproportionate number of kids who are Latino boys who are suspended at higher rates, right, than maybe girls who identify as Asian American. Okay, that's just an example, right? And we see this data. And I'm curious, as a board, what questions would you ask me about that data? So I'm going to ask you, anybody just unmute yourself. What questions would you ask me if I'm presenting this data to you based on race and discipline? And I say the Latino boys are suspended at higher rates than our Asian American girls. Okay, what kind of questions would you ask me? Just feel free, unmute yourself. What kind of questions would you ask me?
Honestly, I don't have a clue. I can't really think of anything. I mean, of what I would ask. Maybe another example.
Okay, Phil, jump in. What do you think? What would you ask me if I shared this data and you see higher suspensions for Latino boys, less suspensions for Asian American girls? Like, what questions would you ask me?
So first off, was the group self-identified, identified by parents, or identified by staff?
Great question. Great question. And so my response would probably be, well, based on the registration, right, that parents get when they bring our kids in, they mark that box. So they identified. But in our data, there's only so many boxes that they're actually even allowed to mark. So that would be based on self-identification, based on race that our families would identify. It's not based on the kid's identity.
So then my next question would be, what is the remediation if needed? So what can we do more of? What should we do less of?
Okay.
I'd like to see I'd like to see the other groups because we can't just compare two random groups because from a statistics point of view, there will be a difference between at least two groups. So it'd be more helpful to maybe see boys versus girls, see also how many kids do we have in each group. Is it, you know, if it's a very small group, even if it's enough that we can still list it, because I know if it's under a certain number, then we can't even list it. But even if it's enough that we can list it, maybe it's still small and maybe it's still not very helpful to compare it to a huge group. So we're comparing a tiny group to a big group. So just kind of more questions regarding statistics and how we got to those findings and what are we looking at exactly.
Got it. Great question.
So I'd have to agree, Carolyn. It's kind of like, what's the presenter's agenda?
So what is the purpose of me presenting that data? Well, okay, so I'll answer a couple of them. So part of my purpose is presenting the data is we have an equity gap and we have some things we need to do, right? We have some decisions we need to make about how do we address this disproportionality gap. We have kids who happen to identify as Latino boys. Okay, that's what we notice in the data. And then we have them being suspended at higher rates. So part of it is like, we need the board to make some decisions to figure out how we're going to address this problem, right? That would be my purpose. I want to fast forward to if our discussion went into what are going to be our actions. What might be some things that we'd want to do to change that discipline data? Kind of actions. I heard like remediation. I think I heard you say, Phil, but what would be like actions that we would think about when we look at data like that, disproportionality based on race? What might be an action step?
So I would look for clusters. You know, is it like one grade at one site? Is it at all the grades in every site? You know, so kind of try to find that. And it's essentially, if it's something you don't think is desirable, then it's a focus on that problem. Now, what's wrong with that is that it's not comprehensive. It's like going from this fire to that fire to this fire to that fire. And so as a board member, you see data like that. And so, okay, what do you want me to do? Like put out this fire and next month it's that fire. And so there we are.
Got it. Yeah, you're on to something, Phil. Anybody else want to jump in?
I would definitely want to know by grade level, just to see if we can kind of get ahead of what's happening. So we see that it's starting to happen, I don't know, maybe with 5th graders, then we can really understand, okay, we need to act before 5th grade. Or if it's happening with 8th graders, then we know, okay, we need to act before 8th grade. So that could be helpful information.
Well said. Well said. So I'm hearing you, if I'm hearing correctly, you would like to get more information to really drill down on who those kids are, not just that big kind of group of Latino boys, but you actually want to know more about who they are, if I'm hearing correctly. You'd want to know more information. And that's kind of where I'm going, right? That's where I'm going, is that we cannot assume all of our kids, one, are monolithic, right? We cannot assume that just because they fit this racial category that we know everything about each kid. What we have to assume is that we need to get more information. We need to know more about each of those kids, not just grade levels, not just, you know, kind of like I think Phil mentioned, like clusters, right? Of really knowing more about each individual kid, but literally also learn about their experience and how they see themselves. Because ultimately, interrupting racial inequities in our schools is going to require us to actually know the story of our kids beyond the label, beyond the data.
So
I'm going to pause 1 second. Did I freeze on you all?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Nicole, it would also be helpful if when you bring the problem, you bring a plan or a solution. Otherwise, we go for another 2 or 3 meetings, and then, you know, time, you know, if it's important, it should be acted on. So I'm not a public education expert, and so I count on someone who tells me there's something should be done, to have an actual, and it should be this or this. 2 choices would be nice, but at least 1.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Phil, because I think one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is you're right. Like, our role as a board is to be at this level, right? And our role is not to be the experts per se. However, it is so important that if you're going to be the policymakers who are going to monitor and ask your superintendent, right, to implement your vision, your policy, you have to have context for what's being reported to you, and you have to know the questions to ask. How do you know that we've actually addressed the issues? So this is part of why we have study sessions, right? To be able to learn more. And so absolutely, you're not going to be the experts at all of it, but you need to have context so you can know what questions to ask so that we don't, remember, go back to our Paul Gorski article. We don't want to perpetuate racial inequities in the name of racial equity, right? And a lot of times it's because we don't have the information, we don't know. So this is why the study session is so important. And just to push yourself, when you see racial data, you got to deconstruct it. We can't assume we have all the answers in just that data. We got to hear the experiences of our kids and our families. And so that's why I bring that up, is how do you deconstruct race? If you as a district are going to unpack racial equity, you got to have context of what it is, and also be comfortable with being able to push back and say, like, look, we recognize that maybe there's a bias laying here, and why our Latino boys have such higher rates? Is it because they behave more badly than girls? That might not be it. It might be we need to ask questions about our discipline matrix, right? Our policies that we have at schools. How, like, I think Carolyn mentioned, like, what grade levels? Maybe there's something going on where in a particular grade level, there's a policy that's implemented that looks different at another grade level. So we got to unpack it, and that's where the board has to know how to ask those questions, okay? And not just look at the data and go, oh, we see that, and let's just assume we know what the answer is to that problem. Because here's what also could happen, is without information, we can say, oh, let's go and let's apply, this many LCAP dollars to our students who happen to be Latino boys who also may be English learners. So let's just assume that we have to allocate money for maybe mentors or some form of intervention, because we assume that that's what the need is, because we see that category of kids based on race, based on gender. And without going into what we call the root cause analysis, what is the problem? Then as a board, you could actually take action, allocate resources towards a problem that actually is not the problem. The problem could be that there's maybe some policy that's implemented at the school that may have been implemented and maybe needs some adjustment. And it just happens to be now it shows up that this group of kids kind of always is in that place of being suspended or referred. I'm going to give you a real clear example, because you have an elementary district, so you have recess, right? Recess causes lots of issues, right? For principals are like, oh, recess, unstructured time. But one thing that you may find when you learn what your kids need is it could be something as simple, oh my gosh, we needed more equipment because our young boys are active and they just want to play. And so what they were doing is they were roughhousing and hitting each other and being really like wrestling and play fighting, which is against the rules, right? And during recess. And what was happening? Referrals, suspensions, way up. And maybe what we needed to do was just get new equipment so that they could have more things, more options on the play yard. Now, without thinking about that, you may go really deep into racial equity because you saw a lot of Latino boys and may miss that. You know what? Maybe at this school, we have a large population of Latino boys. So maybe it's not about bias kicking in, because a lot of times bias could be the reason, but it could actually just be we need to make a small adjustment that may have nothing to do with the board, by the way. The board doesn't really get playground equipment, right? Like, that's for the principals and the staff to deal with. But you see why it's important that we as a board just understand what race is, because it can be the one thing that will keep you really focused on trying to close those gaps, but not understanding the root cause. And we don't want to make any assumptions, because our kids are not monolithic. They all have different needs. So we don't want to make assumptions. We want to actually have that information. So one way that your task force is working through this is they're actually working through the school safety piece, right? And they're looking at discipline. And so you'll see them come with recommendations. So we want to make sure that they come to you, that you have an understanding of what does race mean in the context of the data they're going to share and the recommendations, so that as you think about what are we going to do, we have really good understanding of that. Does that make sense? Okay. And this, like race and racism is like a lot of study sessions, right? It's a lot of work, but I want to go and reiterate what Phil said. You all don't have to be the experts, but you have to understand it. You have to have context so you know what questions to ask, because what are you experts in? You're experts in being board members. And what is your role? To monitor the implementation of your policy. So that's why you got to know kind of what that work is really about, and then let your superintendent be the one to implement. Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so I want to make some connections to kind of what that policy piece looks like. And we're going to go through your policy in a moment, but I want to just share what I call a draft of an equity definition in a moment with you, so that you can really look at, is this what you feel racial equity is? Okay, so just give me one moment. I'm going to replay my screen.
So Nicole, I'm still kind of digesting,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yep.
Lost.
Yep.
What you were just stating, and then basically, the way I'm taking it is coming down to somebody on, let's say a yard duty, doing this stereotypical race profiling of a child who could be Latino, African American, and therefore they are doing something where me, the white kid, could be riding, lighting a firecracker, but they're watching them over there. And that's kind of, is that what you're just kind of, that's what you were just talking about, correct? Or in some.
That would be, yeah, that connects to like bias, right? So bias is like those blind spots and kind of those subconscious kind of ways that we think that sometimes we don't recognize, right? So we tend to, like, it shows up in our actions. So that's a great example. And that's something we have to talk about, once we do professional learning for our teachers and our staff, before we start saying, you're being biased, right? That's not how that works. You want to just really make sure people understand what that is. But you have a great example. I could be on the play yard, and I'll just use myself. How about that? I'll use myself. When I was a principal, I was on the play yard, elementary principal in particular. When I go to the play yard, I knew exactly where I needed to go and who I needed to watch, because I had frequent flyers come through my office, we called it, right? And I had to constantly check myself, because what I didn't want to do is perpetuate bias around always watching the same kids, assuming they were going to do something wrong, right? And they happen to be certain kids who showed up in the office a lot more than others. So as you look at bias, that is something we'd have to talk about around, who are those kids coming through? Are they the same ones over and over and over, right? Are they the same kids? Do they happen to be the same ethnicity? Those are the questions we have to ask. But I always say, be careful, not to share your kind of accountability driven work yet. Let's do support first, right? So this is where professional learning for staff to even be aware of bias, because it is very real, and it is a big root cause behind discipline data. It really is. And I can say, as a high school vice principal, what I found also is that pattern really showed up, and it started in elementary. So those same frequent flyers that were in elementary school, what also happens is, after a while, that message is like, you're always in trouble, you're always in trouble, you always misbehave. And you know what happens? It's almost like that self-fulfilling prophecy. Now they go into middle and high school, and those same kids show up in the office. It's very interesting dynamic. And so another piece of this is go back to like what we do. We label kids, right? So when we think about from year to year, if a kid misbehaves one year in second grade, that label kind of goes with them the third grade, unless we have a really great process for restarting, right? For really interrupting that bias that can taint what the next teacher or the next group of adults who deals with that kid may think. They don't ever get a restart. And so you're on it. That's exactly why we want to be able to ask those questions when that data comes to us as a board, because remember, you're not responsible for addressing it, but you do have to be aware these things happen, right? So that you can be able to ask the right questions. And then your staff can be able to share with you that context so you know where you can support the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so in other words too, is that staff could be in the lunchroom or, talking about a student, and when that student moves on to the grade, that talk will follow that student. So then, in other words, I mean, well, I guess like you said, we set policies. So I mean, how can we set a policy where you don't have the stereotypical profiling of I always think in a job interview, it should be like a confessional box with a voice, with the voice is not male or female. And I always think, a job interview should be, and that like that, and almost how a student should be too. Then you don't have that, that profiling going on, because walks into a job interview, human nature is like, okay, you might think of one thing or another. So.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you saying this, because I use the discipline data as an example, but there's a lot of examples of this.
Yeah.
And so, it's important when I go back to like the why, like one of your questions should be like, why is the data like that, Nicole? Right. And some of it could be around the policy, right? The rules that are set that maybe are not culturally relevant or appropriate for certain students. Because remember, culture is about how we behave, how we think, how we act, and those are connected to our ethnicity, right? And so what happens is, let's just say I set a rule that you need to be really quiet in class all the time. Well, certain cultural nuances of different kids and families, that's contrary to certain families. And who says that's right or wrong, right? And I think that's what we have to look at. Okay, well, what are our rules? Are our rules kind of setting certain kids up to always be in trouble because there's a certain way we do school that has not always been culturally relevant for all kids? And that's where you question, like, okay, what is the policy? What is the rules at school that may be perpetuating some of this discipline data that's disproportionate in terms of who's suspended or referred more? And those are the questions you ask, right? But we don't necessarily like blame, shame, and say, okay, shame school, you need to change your policy. It's more about how do we look at this as what is the root cause? And that's why your task force is so important in this process of unpacking a lot of that. And we have them walking through that, is let's not just look at the hard data, let's look at what's behind it. So you have a great point you brought up.
And I had to look up monolithic. That's my new word for
Oh,
it.
yeah.
I was thinking of 2000 Space Odyssey, showing up, but that's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fancy word for we are not all the same. Right? Yeah. And it's really important because remember, what are stereotypes? Stereotypes are a narrative in our head, right? Mm-hmm. That is overgeneralization of people, a group of people. And racial stereotypes are very much one of those. That's one of the common stereotypes. It's race, it's usually gender, right? And a lot of times sexual orientation may fall in that as well, in terms of like the stereotypes that seem to show up a lot, because those are things we kind of see on the outside of people, right? It's not the whole story. And so often stereotypes become sometimes a narrative. And unfortunately, if we're not careful, we'll assume all kids are the same. And they're not. And we have to really be careful about that at early ages. I worry about it because elementary schools is where kids are young. And once they get set in that box, the kids I talked to today were high school seniors and juniors. And it just made me think about what was their experience when they were in elementary school. So it's really important we recognize that. So I want to give you a little context for a moment as you think about your racial equity statement, because I know we don't have a lot of time. So I want to get right to your statement, which is, again, designed to show up in your policy. Okay. So what I did is I took, if you all remember back on it was actually in January. So I wrote down some comments and statements that you shared around what your definition of equity is. Do you remember that? And you did like the 30-second elevator speech. Do you remember that? You're like, we've slept since then. So I took some notes, and what I did is I just took them and tried to create literally a definition of racial equity. And so it's a draft, and I want to show it to you so you all can just massage it a little bit, talk about what works, what doesn't. And then we also want to give the task force a chance to take a look and them have some input before you decide to adopt it and place it into your policy as you think about amending your policy as well. Okay, so and it's just for fun. It's nothing set in stone. It's just to get you started on a statement. And so the framework of it is similar to what I showed you around the National Equity Project definition. Do you remember that one? The National Equity Project, and it gave you kind of 3 bullet points, and it kind of shared this is what equity is about: giving every child the resources they need to be successful, both academically and socially, right? And it gave you like 3 kind of bullet points about what that looks like. And so I started one for you, and you might hate it, you might love it, but I want to at least have a starting point for us. Okay, so let me, and I tried to capture as much as I could from each of you around what your definition was. And so I'm going to share my screen, and I want you to see what you think. All right, just to get you started. So this is like super rough draft. Based on what I heard you all say, I tried to capture it into a definition. So take a peek. All right, so as you see this definition, okay, this is again a rough draft just to get you started. So I want to open it up for maybe the next 15 minutes. Just kind of go through and talk about what resonates with you about the statement. I'm going to start with kind of the plus, like what resonates with you about the statement in terms of capturing some of your kind of ideas around what racial equity is. So anybody just unmute yourself and jump in. What resonates with you? Yeah, unmute yourself, Bill. Jump in.
All right, I'll break the ice. I like 2 and 3, kind of like the way they're written. Number 1 makes me think that restorative policies and practices are not good. And maybe it's the way I'm reading it. Okay. And the 4th one is, well, so, I've been thinking about this, and if we want to hold a system accountable and you want to meet the student where they are, then is bullet number 4 compatible with social promotion?
Okay. Okay.
I mean, why would you put a 3rd grader in a 4th grade class? That's not, that's not meeting them where they're at, and it certainly is not faith,
Okay. Got it. Okay.
I'm not following that. Do you mind going into that a little more, Phil?
Which one? Number 1 or number 4?
Number 4, and
okay.
And what would mean a 3rd grader going into a 4th grade class?
I'll give you an example. I am now in 4th grade, going into 5th grade. It really doesn't matter what I know or don't know. I'm going to 5th grade. But when I go to 5th grade, if I have a 4.5 grade level math, I am now going to be in a 5th grade math class. That is not appropriate for where I'm at. And it certainly is not meeting me where I'm at. And so shouldn't I be repeating or going to summer school or getting an ILP or something to get me to the next grade before I'm actually dumped in there? It's kind of like you don't go swimming in the deep end of the pool until you know how to swim.
I'm not understanding the connection to number 4 on that one.
Well, you want to close accountability gaps and you want to hold the system accountable. The system right now moves students along regardless of where they're at. So we're on a system that is a 9-year and out system, K-8 and you're out. It's not based on what level of development you are or anything like that. It's just like you start in K and then you end up in 8, and that's preordained.
It's interesting because I think I see it as the flip of that, right? Like, that's right. We're going to hold the system accountable. So we're going to close those gaps so that no one's going to that next grade level without being properly prepared.
Right.
So language is interesting in the way we all process things.
But the bias right now is to move you regardless of your skill level.
Got it. So let's kind of recenter for 1 second. So one of the things that I want you all to do is go too deep into the weeds. What I want you to think about is your statement is kind of a big picture lens for everything you do, right? So that was one example that Phil brought up, which is definitely like, how do we rethink our system, right? How we promote kids, right? Because there's a lot of things that are going to come up that you think about. But does that bullet point capture kind of the big picture about addressing these inequities in your system? Okay, so without going too deep into the weeds, because then what'll happen, you also want to start adding lots of words that then make it so wordy that you really can't, you'll put yourself in a box. So remember, we're big picture, 30,000 foot. This lens applies to everything in the district. So you want to stay pretty broad, if that makes sense. Does that help?
It helps me. Thank you.
Okay.
Could someone explain to me of what restorative policies and practices mean, specifically what it looks like?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's related to a lot of the work we've done, well, in the whole district, but really specifically at the middle school level, when we were talking about some discipline issues, right? And in implementing the ruler program, which was about recognizing, understanding, and labeling emotions, and then taking a look at that combined with some of our other practices like PBIS, and thinking through how we respond to correcting student behavior rather than just being disciplinary in nature, but how can, like, if you steal something of mine, I'm going to use a simplistic example. You steal something of mine and then you get in trouble for it, but I'm never involved in that. Has anything been restored to me as the person, who might be the victim? Versus a restorative practice where we're going to engage, and rather than just punishing you, you're going to have to engage with me. I'm going to get to tell you how that made me feel. And both parties are engaged in that process so that there's a restoration of the community, so to speak. So that's a brief explanation of how we've focused on restorative practices.
And so it applies only to discipline, right? I'm not missing something that it also applies to learning or other aspects, right? I'm asking the question because I'm just wanting to make sure that I understand the word. And so my understanding was that was just for discipline, and so correct me if I'm wrong, if that's not the case.
And let me do this. I'm gonna wait. Let me push escape. I'm gonna, while you all are discussing it, I'm gonna wordsmith a little bit.
I'll speak for us, and then that is the context that we've used it in. Yes.
Yeah. And so what I'll do is I'm going to take it out because it may just be too much in the weeds, and it's just referring to discipline, right? So it's a good question, Carolyn.
I think it's confusing because I thought that the statement was broader, and so I thought maybe I was missing something, and that there was
you're right.
It was different from what I understood it initially. So
no, good catch. Yep. So is there something missing here that may be more appropriate when you think about this first bullet? Is intentionally and continuously disrupting barriers and mental models that harm historically marginalized student groups. And it could be that you just leave this off, right? That this is just not there at all. Or you can have like maybe calling out what that looks like, because these bullet points are more like what it looks like, right? So this is really saying kind of more actionable, big picture. So like if I took this off, would that look better?
What if it were something like using policies and practices to intentionally and continuously disrupt?
Mm.
I mean, I like that it's a more concrete action
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about policies and practices.
So I could have just left it actually, huh? It's just not saying which policies and practices, not being specific.
Well, then basically, are we saying that we are intentionally and continuously disrupting barriers?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're doing, right? Is that,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm still thinking. Okay.
I mean, I think what oh, sorry.
So Nicole, the very first sentence talks about each student, and then the very first bullet breaks out a section of students. So they're not really compatible.
Yeah. So here's my push. Oh, can you all hear me okay? Is it freezing?
Mm-hmm.
I can hear you.
Okay. So what could be something to think about is you have the word racial in here. So what this tells me is you have to call out what you're referring to. And so, yes, it's about, equity work is about each kid, right? Equity applies to each kid because what you called out is their full potential, right? It's not just about one academic space. It's not just about, a social space. It's everything, right? In every kid. But the work is about closing gaps because every kid, based on your data, your racial data is not being served in the same way. So this is why we typically do call it out because you have a racial equity statement. So I even wonder about this word, historically marginalized, what I came up with, but do you actually want to call out historically marginalized groups based on race? I mean, I don't know if you want to call that out, but that's where that came from, Phil.
Well, what if you're not historically? What if you're like newly?
Oh, well, that's a good one. That's come up for boards too, where they'll say like just marginalized, right? It's not even about historical or current, it's just marginalized, right? So that's a good call.
Yeah, because remember, we want general.
Yep. Got it. Okay. Keep going. Jump in, you all. What else sticks out? What do you like, or something you want to change? And we want to massage this into what really works for you. Remember, and this is just an ongoing document. We're not going to finalize anything tonight. It's just kind of getting you started with a discussion that you can get feedback from your stakeholders. But again, your broad lens for what racial equity is in your district. Think about what else.
I think one thing that I feel it's missing is when it says in the introduction, we are committed to equity, which is ensuring that each student has access and opportunities to resources based on their needs in order to reach their full potential. I feel like there's just a couple of pieces where I just want to say, like, I want to say needs and aspirations or something, because I feel like with needs, it's like we're trying to meet the minimum type thing, I guess. And maybe in addition to access and supports, because I'm just thinking of, you can have access to that 5th grade math class, but if you can't not read the materials, then you'll need support to be able to access it. Or if you cannot articulate your whatever it is that, just something like that.
Okay. So just adding the word supports might be something that will be helpful. That sound a little bit more. And then you mentioned something else, Jen, about like not just meeting their basic like minimum like needs. I appreciate that. But do you think full potential kind of speaks to like the tip of the Maslow's, right? Like that is like everything about who they are. Do you think that captures it or no?
I don't know. I feel like it's used a lot. And
yeah,
I don't know if there's another way to capture what does full potential mean for a 6-year-old. It might, you know what I mean? Like it's what I don't know.
And I think, well, and Jen, here's what's interesting is remember, you want to stay like broad so that you don't put yourself in a box and not be able to like apply this lens to every kid, right? So I think that's where you probably are like trying to think like real deep, and it makes sense because you want to be able to measure this, right? You want to be able to say this happened. And so I think what you're saying makes sense, but if you go too deep, it might now put you in that box where it's just about the child at like 6 years old versus the 10-year-old. That makes sense. And so I think leaving it broad makes sense, but I want to make sure I capture, the part that you were sharing, like that full potential, is what I kind of hear you saying, but you feel like it may be a different word because there's like what they need, but then it's like what they desire, like,
no, totally. I appreciate that. And I think Carolyn, step in, and anytime you're the wordsmith, I am definitely not the wordsmith here. We're committed to equity, which is ensuring that each student has access and supports to opportunities and resources. I think that's switched around there because you have the access and you need the support, access and supports. There's something here I'm missing.
I feel like grammatically there's something wrong and I can't quite.
Right, there is, so sorry, my inner Carolyn's coming out here, and I think based on their needs and aspirations to meet their full potential, because if we solely base it on their needs and not really what they are aspiring, maybe we're not really ensuring they get to that full potential. We're just getting them through, just getting them across. Thank you.
Okay, so I need help somewhere here. How do you want that to be?
Can I offer a suggestion that might help with this sentence? I'd kind of like to see, in Soquel School District, we are committed to equity, like full stop, period. And then a second sentence, this means, we ensure that each student has access. And
So do you feel like that's like another bullet point? Maybe you think this is just a whole separate bullet point?
I mean, I think it's nice to have a sort of this definition of equity.
Okay.
I think having it as a statement and then kind of a definition and then leading folks into the bullet points. I also think Carolyn is also an expert, I think, on writing things in a way so that they're more accessible to folks, right? Carolyn, there's something about like a certain
We're
level.
gonna send this to Kim for sure.
Like, so to me, having it in.
Well, the thing is, I look at this also, it's very adult. And it took me a while to really read it and understand it, and that's me. Another way, we want our students to understand this.
Yep.
And then do we want somebody who is not as quick as a reader as I am, especially when it's beyond monosyllabic words that would take time to really sit here and read.
Yeah.
So
we want to simplify this a little bit.
At the 4th grade reading level, that would be ideal.
Pardon me?
If we're able to change it so that it reads at a 4th grade reading level, that would be ideal. So
Got it. Okay.
It's gonna be hard because there's just a lot of things I feel like we want to say, and a lot of those things are complicated words. And
got it.
Try.
Got it.
And I totally agree with that because I'd sit there at the road sign just for an hour trying to, take it in and understand it.
Got it.
And you get to the last sentence and you go, what did the first sentence say?
Right.
So
No,
can I jump in real quick? So where it says has access, so has access to appropriate, and then the rest, and then where reach their full potential. CSBA uses every student succeeds. So, we could probably use their words.
Okay. All right, so let's read it back to me. So this means ensuring that each student has access
to appropriate supports and opportunities for resources. I'm not sure if you need to put access and opportunities in the same sentence.
Okay. Let's just take it all together. All right. based on their needs and aspirations to succeed. Is that more what you're kind of leaning towards?
Yeah, and then the end is to, in order for every student to succeed. There you go.
Okay. All right.
And if there's a way that you could take that first sentence and center it, because then it stands out.
Oh, this sentence right here.
No, the first sentence and center it.
So do you want this like a bullet point? And that's out the way.
So
Or you want this? I see what you mean. Okay.
Make this means a new line.
Are you being Carolyn right now? Okay? Let me go back, because you know, Carolyn, this gonna end up on your desk. You know that. So you can wordsmith and play with it. You want it like that?
No,
right,
just
so
the first sentence.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll figure that out, Phil. Okay.
Yeah,
So
I like
here's what
Amanda's
want you to
idea.
think
I
about.
like Amanda's idea of putting it out there and having some pop to it.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
let's
like
bold
this
it and
All right. All right. You all are technical. Okay. My English teachers. All right. Now, here's what I want you to think about. Okay, let's kind of get out of the semantics for 1 second, and I want to show you something that will help you think about moving forward. So this is just, remember, a starting point. What I hear you say is we want to simplify this, the language. So that's something we can do. We don't have to do it tonight. We'll simplify it. I think we want to get more feedback from folks to get more input. We want to let Carolyn like really mess with it. So I'll make sure I email this to you all so Carolyn can put her hands to it, and then maybe let the Racial Equity Task Force take a stab at it too. But I want to share something with you just as you think about how you're developing your statement, like beyond just today. Is I want you to think about, you know, is it communicating like common language that can become a lens for all of the work? So that's what, remember I said about being very general, right? Like you don't want it to be very specific and it not apply to all aspects of your school district. So it's a lens, right, is what it should be. It'll be a part of your policy, right? So this is not a standalone item. While you'll use it, you know, for language to kind of apply it to the work you're doing, it sits in your policy, right? So this is what you'll add to your policy when you amend it. This is the piece that goes in it. Is it student-centered? Okay, so you want to make sure it's very clear it's about kids, right? Is it calling out the inequities in the data explicitly? So that's where I was sharing about why those historically marginalized or marginalized student groups, because you're saying it's racial equity statement. So is it calling out where that data is really showing the inequities? You got to call it out. Is it measurable and associated with data? So can you take this kind of statement and apply it to say, we saw that? Like, can it be measured? Can it show up in data that you interrupted through policy, right? That you cultivated student success? Like, can you actually measure that? So that's what's going to make you go, oh, let's revisit it. Is it aligned with like your mission and your vision, right? So a lot of times we want to make sure that the language is not something that's way out in left field compared to what you've already shared, but it could be that this becomes your mission and vision, which is often what happens, right? It's kind of like, this is where we want to be is our vision, and this is how we're going to get there through our mission, right? And so that often what happens with an equity statement. And then of course, does it include the stakeholder voices in your process? And that's something you all have to think about. So you don't ever want to adopt like a statement like this without getting feedback from your stakeholders who it's about. Okay, so that's something you want to think about too. So this is where I always talk about the non-closure. Like, don't feel like you should adopt something right away. Just take that process, use it so you can really massage it and make it your own. Does that make sense? Yeah, jump in, Phil.
Okay, so this is a generic equity statement. So we could use this kind of a guide if we're doing like economically disadvantaged equity or gender equity. So we're going to have a bunch of equity statements. So you're saying that this is what all of them should look like?
That's a good question. So your district called out racial equity. So you want to be really clear as a board, is this your common vision around the work? Is this about racial equity? Which is ultimately, it's calling out race, right? But equity work is really about all kids. Like, we don't want to say it's only about kids based on this ethnicity, but you got to remember, you called out racial equity because you have specific gaps that show up. So that's something you all need to discuss. Like, do we want to make it super general, or do we want to make it about racial equity? And that's something you have to decide. It's a great question. Anyone want to chime in? Because when I met you all, or I should say, yeah, when I met you all, this is what you kind of focus on, and you have a task force that's focused on racial equity, which is what we as consultants are pushing them to think about. What is that racial lens? But we start with the definition of equity first, of course, as you said, Phil, because there's a lot of different groups of kids that fall in that. But do you all want to stay centered on racial equity, or do you want to lift it up and really look at equity from kind of a general sense so that you can really apply it where it really, the focus, and again, based on the data, explicitly based on the data. Anyone want to chime in?
What I'm saying is that this slide, because it doesn't say racial equity at the top, is a great generic kind of template for future equity policies. Right.
And I just shared, as I say, equity statement, because to some degree, every client has a different focus. But remember that fourth bullet there says explicitly calls out inequities in the data, right? That's the word, that's where race fits in, right? So if it's about socioeconomic status, because that's why you're like, go back to the why you're doing this work. There's specific equity gaps. Is it about students with special needs? You want to call it out in your statement, but ultimately, it's your lens by which you do all work. And so if you're going to focus on racial equity, then that means that every question you have, right, every decision you make is through a racial equity lens, meaning that we're always looking at the impact on our students based on racial factors. You're calling it out, which is not a problem. It's not a problem. It's just you ought to have a common understanding of what that means as a team, and understand that it's not that you're not paying attention to other students who don't fall under some racial category, but it is about you being explicit about we want to address racial equity gaps. So it's up to you all. It's really your work. So I don't want to tell you what to do, but yes, this slide is just general. I'm just kind of sharing it, key components of an equity statement, but your statement has to be yours, right?
Yeah, I
Anyone
think
else want to chime in?
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
right on in there. Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with Phil that this is a great, template. Should we have a need in the future for an equity statement around any other particular issue, I think it's very important that the work we're doing right now is leading us to a explicitly labeled racial equity statement, right? And the work that it's really going to lead us to be very, very conscious about. I mean, I'd love to see us eventually, hey, maybe this is something we're going to read at board meetings the way we read our mission statement, right? I mean, when we had, we used to have every board item that we discussed would, underneath it was sort of italicized which item in the LCAP it tied back to, just ways of reminding ourselves this is the work that we're doing. And I think as it becomes this ingrained practice, it is the same, we will be doing the same kind of work and putting it into practice across all areas. That's my hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on. You're spot on. Absolutely. Other thoughts about your racial equity statement? Do you feel like you want to stay really centered on racial equity, or do you feel like you want to lift it and kind of call it your equity statement? I think this is an important discussion to have as you think about the work you're doing. Anyone else want to chime in?
So I would say that we could do the racial equity policy statement, because it will give us practice on the process. We're going to have to share with our stakeholders. I don't know if we need to have the lawyer look at it, but all of that stuff that has to happen. So that in the future, if we have another equity area that we think is relevant and important for students to succeed, then we have a template and we have this work that we've done already that we can apply.
Good point. Yeah, absolutely. And remember, you all can get feedback from your stakeholders. You never want to just stop here. You all could be like, in one place, and your stakeholders, like your parents, your kids, are like, that's not what we think it is at all, right? And so that's why you want to make sure you don't rush this process either, because Amanda was on it. Like, it is designed to be your lens for aligning your decisions, right, around the work you do. And so it's nice to have your statement kind of sitting there next to you, at the dais to say, okay, we're going to make the decision about budget. How are we doing that with our racial equity lens, right? We're going to make a decision about how we're going to reopen schools, right? How we're going to look at our grading policy or look at homework, whatever those things may be that rise to your level. It's important to have a common lens, right? Which is going to drive the questions you ask. Right? It's going to drive the decisions you make about any policy that you're looking at implementing over time throughout the district. So it's definitely a process. I think, Phil, you called it. It's a process for sure, but you do want to have, at some point, you want to land on a common language. That's the purpose of this. Because what we don't want to do is have the whole elephant blind man process go forever and ever without saying that that's an elephant, right? Like, what'll happen is people will forever be confused about what your work is if you don't have a statement. This is what it is. Can y'all still hear me? I think I got kicked out.
I heard you.
We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like my video got kicked out. You all can't see my screen anymore, correct?
Right. Just audio.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, for some reason it's loading and loading. All right, so I'm gonna just stop for a second. But this discussion, since you can hear me, I'm just gonna keep rolling, and then I'll figure out how to reboot my video. So I want to kind of give you a sense of like where this is going so that you can kind of connect it to your policy. And so before we put a pin in your statement conversation, I want to make sure you're all good with your next steps on what you want to do with this statement. So again, I heard that let's simplify this, right? Let's kind of bring it to 4th grade level. Let's make it really something we can understand and own, right? And so also, we want to have an opportunity to allow our stakeholders, including our task force, to weigh in. Does that sound like a good next step for your statement process?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, so the task force is going to take a look at the statement? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah, so absolutely. So part of the work they do is they have been learning about equity. They've been kind of action planning in their subcommittees, and they focus on 3 different areas, right? They focus on staffing, student achievement, and school safety. And so in that action plan, the definition of racial equity should definitely be the lens by which they are recommending things to you, right? So they should really align with that. And so what we want to do is make sure they can at least have context of here's what racial equity could mean for us, and make sure that they can give some input on that. But remember, even the task force is not the end all of the work, right? Like, you still have work to implement. You have more voices to collect. One of the things the task force also has begun to identify is who's missing at the table, right, from the task force. They're not your entire community. What data might be missing. And sometimes that data is just hearing the voices of your kids, right? So it's really hearing what they think equity is. So so they would be one of many to be able to weigh in on your statement. So that's why I say you don't have to adopt it like right away, but it's a great source of discussion in your district as you go through that process.
So it seems like we're talking about 2 separate things, though. We had the racial equity mission statement that we were working on, our statement, and then the last slide was equity statement. And Phil made a comment that it should be racial equity or just equity, it being inclusive, just not the racial, but disabilities.
That's what I'm saying is that second slide is a generic equity checklist. And that applies to, I think it would apply to any equity statement that we make in the future, this one and any in the future. So it's like, if we're thinking about having, say, an ELL equity statement, so you would want to check all those same boxes.
Okay. Okay.
So is that what we want to do? We want to have one different equity statement for each type of situation, or do we want to have one that just kind of encompasses everything? And I'm not saying that I know what is the correct thing to do, but I'm just posing the question to make sure that we know what we're choosing. And I feel like I'm asking a very good question for the task force as well, to see what their thoughts are on it.
So to help clarify, your racial equity statement shows up in your policy, right? So it's not, you don't have like different statements. You have a statement, and it is the lens by which you apply to all of your governance practices, right? Your questions you ask, your decisions you make when you take action. So it's really having one, and it should align with your mission and vision statement. And so if you feel like even in this process, if you feel like, you know what, we want to kind of go back to our mission statement and we want to massage that, right? And really say, this is, when we say racial equity in SoCal, this is what we mean, right? And so I think, you know, how you all want to determine that is important, because it should be something the board owns. It should be something that you say, this is what we mean when we say racial equity. Does that make sense? So it should really be one lens that we have. It's one common language is what you're wanting to develop in your district. One common language.
So
that's broad enough that it can apply to many different spaces. That makes sense.
So I hear what you're saying, and let me tell you, I'm all for general. You know, it just gives you much more wiggle room and stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm concerned about the detour. So if you make all this work into a general equity statement, and then say that applies to whatever issue you bring to me, environment, gender, we got it. It's that same thing. So it doesn't really have then a punch, you know. And I'd rather have a multiple bunch of equity statements, because that calls out that thing and says who we are and what we are about. And you know, digital space is pretty cheap, you know, so.
Well, I'm going to challenge you. You all are pretty busy people. I'm not sure you can keep up with 4 or 5 equity statements, to be quite honest. I think what you're saying, Phil, is really powerful, though, is like to keep it general, but still be very conscious of we need to call out racial inequities. And so I'm going to reshare the screen for a second, because I think this is where you may be able to address this. And just tell me what you think, and then we'll make a connection and shift to your policy conversation. But let me see if this will help. So let's just say we go like this. And this is just playing around with it. We take the word racial out of your statement in itself, and we call it your equity statement. So just playing with that. But then in that, you're calling out equity, because again, it does apply to all children, right? Because you're talking about their full potential, right? Well, we changed it to for them to succeed, which is kind of whole child, right? But then when you look at this particular bullet here, if you call out race here and you're talking about marginalized student groups, and you can even say racial student groups or groups based on race, something like that, that's going to give you that tug and that pulse check. Every time you make a decision, we apply our equity statement, but let's make sure we are very clear that it's always going to be about making sure we interrupt the spaces where racial equity gaps exist. So maybe that's where it shows up here. Does that make sense? And I'm just putting words in here just to.
Or in the first line.
Say it again.
Or in the very first line at the top.
Okay, so what I was saying is keep this general is what I was thinking you said, and then maybe here is where you call out race. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know.
No? Okay.
I say we are committed, at the very first line, we are committed to racial equity, and then our equity work includes, and then the word says our equity work includes, but is not limited to.
Okay. And again, we want to simplify some of this language, which we can definitely do. So this is something you all have to wrestle with, right? And this is why I bring this up, because you have to own this, right? One of the things that happens in lots of districts, and I'm sure you all have experiences, is that we'll have like a mission statement, we'll have a vision statement, but we really never go to it. We don't really even remember it, and we don't really apply it to the things we do, right? And so we want to make sure that when you bring up this statement, it's something that you own, that makes sense to you. Like Ted said, I need it to be simple so that it makes sense to me. Like that's what you all want to do with this particular statement. And so that when it shows up in your policy, that it really speaks volumes about the work that you're doing as a governance team, because your work is driven by policy. That's who you are as policy makers. You're not the implementers of the work, you're the policy makers. So if you have this statement as your equity policy, and that policy really guides your governance, this is where you own it. And this is that policy that doesn't go on the shelf somewhere and collect dust. You all know the process. I mean, this is that policy that kind of guides all policy, if that makes sense, right? And so that's why this statement is so important, that it makes sense to you. So I don't want you to rush or feel like you have to solve it tonight. This is not the purpose tonight, but it's to get you started on how you want to develop some language. And maybe you want to have a future study session to continue to unpack this. You know, allow your task force to wrestle with it. Have some listening sessions to hear, you know, what families and kids think about it. That's the power of something like this. And that's where you get to own it, right? You own it beyond just, let's just pass this and adopt it and that's it. So I appreciate the dialogue, because this is what's needed for this work. Questions? You feel like you're okay with putting a pin in it for a second? Ted, you're like, no.
Well, yeah, I guess we'll have to put a pin in it for a second. I mean, it have to be a little while too to have a pin in it. I mean, I'm just got to stare at it and.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I think it's like a good learning about ourselves. I'm feeling it too, Ted, where it is hard, and this has come up in board meetings before too. Sometimes it's just really hard to process something when you're getting it right then in the moment. And I understand that that's the nature of this, you know, this workshop and the work we're doing. But we do tend to like to get something ahead of time and and think on it a bit before we really tug at it. So I love the idea of, yeah, I'll put a pin in it, but I'm coming back.
Yeah, and it's not designed, tonight was not designed for you all to make a decision. Remember, this is a literally exposure to the collective work you've been doing, and now coming to a space of, let's look at what our statement might be. Let's have a starting point, and let's now have a place for people to have discussions and give you feedback. And eventually you do want to put a pin in it, right? Eventually you want to adopt, you want to have it in your policy, and you want to like be done with it, to be quite honest, and then now apply it. So that's always the next steps for board. After you adopt it, you want to apply it. You don't want to adopt and stick it on the shelf. So, so Amanda, definitely this requires, what I usually do with boards after I start this process, I'll send it to you, let you all wrestle with it. It's yours, right? Remember, you can tear this up and have something totally different when we're done with this. So this is for you to just have a starting point. And again, giving yourself a discussion point so that when you bring people together, there's something to talk about, right? And there's something for them to give you feedback on. And again, this shows up in your policy, which you already have a policy. So when you revisit your policy in a moment, we're going to talk about what are those things that you may want to adjust, right? And amend your policy so that you can have your statement in there, and also things that may be missing from your policy that you want to really bring it alive. Okay, so that you have, again, guidance for how you govern your work with your equity, your racial equity lens. Okay. Scott, did you have any thoughts you want to add?
No, I just appreciate the process, and I know, you know, this group takes every word very seriously. That's why things come out good. I did not to I did see a comment in the chat box from Jessica that I think would be at least good to put on the table. Not necessarily that we have to go in depth with it now, but something to consider. So let's see.
Yeah, sorry, let me pull it up.
Yeah, I saw that.
So she mentioned, you know, that a lot of the work we're doing is around being assets oriented and thinking about students and adults and just where that might fit into the statement. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Yep.
And
Yeah.
Scott and Nicole, none of this statement, it seems like it applies to staff.
Tell me more about what you mean.
It's all students. So a parent could, a parent could be treat a staff member, or a staff member could treat a parent in an inequitable way, but that's not part of our policy.
Got it. I see what you mean. Okay.
Well, I think our equity policy, like the actual board policy, covers everyone. I mean, we're about to, I might be proven wrong in a second when we click over to it, but the statement is saying this is what we are, you know, it's kind of like our mission statement too, is all about addressing student needs, and we're here to make sure every single student succeeds. So this is a statement in terms of our beliefs in the work that we're doing. That's my take.
Got it. No, I appreciate you saying that. Definitely, equity applies to all, you know, your stakeholders. But when I mentioned earlier, it's focused on students. It really is about student outcomes. But if we don't have healthy adults that don't have what they need, then you're right. It definitely makes a difference in terms of how you would really process that particular focus. Okay, let me see something. So what I did is I added Jessica's comment or her some language to that that statement. And so what I'll do is I'm going to reshare it, and then what I'll do is we're going to transition to your policy in a moment. Okay, let me share my screen. There we go. So what I did is I placed it in this second bullet, and that may be a place you all want to explore it a little bit more. Or it may be even in the third bullet, but I feel like it fit somewhere in here. So we could definitely, you could massage that a little bit more, but I like it. I love it.
See, I really don't understand what asset oriented for, you know, what that actually means. And how
yeah,
that.
Jessica, you want to unmute and share? Yeah, maybe Jessica can unmute and share what her thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you. I was just, you know, thinking about how much work we've done to not look at students just in terms of their needs, but in terms of their strengths. Because when we look at all of them, you know, being completely student-centered means that we see, you know, every bit of them, the parts that we need to help and the parts that we need to highlight. And that includes their strengths, not just their challenges or the opportunities that we need to provide to them based on a deficit.
Well said, yeah. I almost feel like when Jen, when she was talking about aspirations, I feel like that's also kind of fit in there too. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Well, I think what the asset thing is that, so I may not know how, you know, physics very well, but I do know how to lead a group of people in a project. And so that's an asset, especially out in the working world. So how do you recognize that?
Yep, well said. Absolutely. Great example. Carolyn, do you have one?
Maybe we could change the word asset to strength, just to make it a little easier to understand.
So instead of this, maybe the word
How about strength-based or strength? strength focused.
So I'll say to you that the asset term is, out there right now as part of the language in the community.
Okay.
What term is that, Phil? The asset?
How about I leave it as both, and you all can fiddle with that.
So Phil, what's the term? You're saying asset is the term?
Yeah, the whole student asset, what you're bringing to the table, what is the student bringing to the table? So what assets do you have? Okay. So that's a whole, let's look at that at equal strength to other things that are traditional measurements. And so that's a non-traditional measurement.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah.
And they're calling it assets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's just a difference of wording. I know Ted was saying let's simplify it. So I think maybe strength might be more simplified than assets when you're thinking about wanting to kind of make it, like you mentioned, like kind of this fourth grade kind of, spirit to it, elementary age spirit to it. So I'll let you all fiddle with that. Okay. We won't have to make a decision tonight, but I appreciate that addition.
That'll be in the AR.
Perfect. All right, so here, let's do this. As we get ready to transition, we have about a half hour, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to look at your policy. And so the way I want to share this is through reminding you about a conversation we had in our last session. Let me just blow this up a little bit. Do y'all remember this slide? And the spirit of this slide was to help you think about like how to really prioritize what you're going to do in your kind of racial equity work, because there's a lot of racial inequities, right? There's a lot of different things that you're going to need to tackle, but can you do it all? No. You're a busy board. You have lots of policies to oversee, but it's really about looking at effective boards really prioritize their work, right? And so the things that really show up at your board level should really fall into like these 4 areas, right? And things that don't fall in these areas really are things that probably should be passed over to your superintendent, right? And say, you know what, Scott, this is your lane, right? The things that are more technical, more operational, those are the things that don't always need to be addressed by a board. Maybe you need to be aware, but it's not the things you prioritize, especially when it comes to equity work. So often effective boards have these 4 things that kind of rise to the top. So your budget, obviously, remember we talked about that. You have to be physically responsible. Obviously, your school climate is a big deal. So we talked earlier, suspensions and referrals. Those are all things you absolutely should be concerned with. The social emotional learning space, the engagement, those parent engagement, those are all kind of like school climate safety. Your teaching and learning, right? We're here to educate kids. So obviously, it's a big deal. Teaching and learning, student achievement should rise to your desk. And of course, human resources staffing is a big deal because you spend, 80, 85, 90% of your budget is on staff. So quite naturally, the board should absolutely have that as a priority. And so I share this with you because when you go back to your equity statement, think about how you wanted to apply that. And I said, let's be able to apply this to everything we'll do. Well, what are those things that we do? Well, they should be prioritized here. Okay, and so as you think about our equity work, how are we going to really stay focused on the things that are going to be most impactful in our district? And you remember I used that silly example about the palm trees being planted in front of the schools. Do you remember that one? And I said, you're going to have people who are going to come to you and they're going to have their definition of equity. And their definition may be about the palm trees and that you have more palm trees planted in front of one school than another. And they're going to come to you and say, you need to address that, Board of Education. And you're going to kindly listen. And then you're going to kindly pass that to your superintendent. And then you're going to kindly say, thank you. We are, definitely very much, we are very much committed to equity work as you have in your statement. But the palm trees planted in front of the schools is just not one of our priorities. And so we're going to pass that to our superintendent. You see why it's important to know what equity is and also educate your community, because everyone's going to have a different definition and also a priority about what needs to be addressed. And as a board, you don't have time to address the palm trees in front of the schools. You got kids to educate. So you see, that's a silly example, but it's so real. And I'm sure you've actually had some that are similar. Is bless your community's heart. Folks don't all have the same like view on it. And that's okay. But they do have to be educated and learn how you govern, right? And you run the school district. You govern through policy. And so the palm trees planted in front of the schools are not a priority. And you have to really be able to articulate that and have that conviction around the work you're going to do. Now, what is a priority should show up in your policy. Go ahead, Phil.
Yes to all of this, but I think you're missing on the palm tree thing, you're missing something very important. And what's not on here is politics. And so you just cannot.
Tell me more about that.
Well, you can't dismiss the voters as, not part of what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I said that. I definitely didn't say dismiss. I actually said the opposite. I said you want to listen, right? You want to embrace and hear them, but you also want to help educate them on governance. Because you got to remember, people voted for you, but may not be experts in governance. So what they understand as what is important, not that you don't honor it and listen. And actually, like I said, you're going to address it. It's just that's not your priority. So what you do is you listen to them and you give that to your superintendent, is my point, right? That's what I'm referring to when you talk about the politics. Your role is not to implement and get into the weeds. That's where I'm going.
So the palm trees may be big weeds, but I will tell you that a palm tree issue is probably more than enough threshold for a recall.
Okay, and so we should probably talk offline and do some coaching around that, because here's the deal. When you do equity work, you remember what I said earlier about this is going to get messy and it's going to get really hard. And part of it is because of what you just shared, which is a great example, right? Is that there are some things that are hot topics and important to some of your constituents. And you absolutely should honor that. I'm not saying to dismiss it, but what I want to say is effective boards with talking about closing equity gaps. If that's what you're going to do, sometimes the palm trees don't take precedent over educating your kids. And if palm trees in front of the schools do not correlate to closing equity gaps and actually impacting how students learn, then you have to have that courageous conversation. And not to say we're not going to talk about facilities, right? And we're not going to talk about the buildings, which are important for kids to have. But it's just about prioritizing is all I'm saying. It's not saying not to address it. But you do have to prioritize your work, or what's going to happen is you're going to spend more time on operational issues and less time on the things that are most prioritized and impactful for student achievement. And that's a courageous conversation to have, which I don't think turned into a recall. It turned into a conversation. And I think you have to talk about this over time. So, Phil, I appreciate you bringing that up, because lots of boards have to wrestle with that. So it's a great example. But I think over time, what I'm sharing with you is how you create a culture of governance, right? This is not an overnight process. This is sharing with you professional learning opportunities to help you all grow as a board and build that capacity. Because if you want to do equity work, you're going to have to prioritize the work, or else you're going to be all over the place based on what people perceive as equity. And it's important that you have that conversation to be very real. And it has to be also a collective conversation. It can't be just one individual dealing with facilities, and that's important to you, right? But then it's not a priority for the whole board. So when I'm sharing what on the screen is about the whole board, it's not one individual, right? And when we come together as a governance team, we're always one, right? And so that's what we have to talk about. If palm trees comes up from our constituents, that's a board conversation that we have to talk about. Do we even put that on our agenda, right? And that's why we have priorities as a board, right? We always have to have priorities. Very, very critical for equity work, or you will never get to the space of closing gaps. It won't happen, because you'll be very much stuck in the weeds again. And board members' role is to be 30,000 foot level, right? Our superintendent's role is to run the school district and implement. And that's why it's important you all have this conversation. This is part of the work. I'll go back to this document here, this slide here. Do you remember this one? This is always a good reminder about how to, like, when you're getting stuck on, like, where do we fit in all of this? Like, where do the palm trees fit, right? Is that above the blue line? Is that below the blue line? Is that superintendent role? Is that board member role? And one way to determine that is, what are our priorities? And our role as a board is to operate based on policy. And you got to go back to where does this fit in policy? And is this our priority as a board? Very important. Hope that helps and makes a little bit of sense. Definitely a non-closure moment, though. It's something you all have to talk about as a team. This is good retreat conversation. When y'all do your board retreat, this is a good one to talk about our priorities and our goals. What are they? Because if it doesn't fit in our priorities, it's not something that's going to get a lot of our time. That's what effective governance teams do. And it takes time to build that culture, by the way. That's not an overnight process. But I hope that helps a little bit.
I think it's, mindset, and it's been part of our, like when we've did CSBA, I just forgot the name, the reboot, when we bring on somebody new. That's all. Yeah, that's always a focus, right? Is being mindful about where the majority of your time goes to curriculum and instruction, and to matters of equity in this case. And it always takes recalibration, right? Because it's easy to get off on other things, and just being mindful to always work to calibrate on those high level things.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And that's why I love board retreats, or opportunities to do that, and study sessions, right? Just giving yourself that time. And when you have new board members come on, you always want to I call it recentering the work, to make sure you establish a culture that works for you. Because remember, every board is different, right? Everyone has different personalities. Every superintendent has different personalities, leadership styles. So you have to do what works well for you. And that's where that respect for each other's styles come into play. And that's the conversation you'll have to have around whose job is what, right? So there's some basic ones, board role, superintendent role. But then there's okay, when this comes up, how do we handle this? And that's why you all have to create that culture. So it definitely takes some time to do that. Now, one of the things I want to do so that we can just make sure we get to your policy is I want to have you pull out your CSBA policy. And I think, let me see something. I'm going to stop share for a second so I can pull it up. And Scott, I feel like you put it in the chat earlier, but I want to make sure.
Yeah, 538 in the chat. There's a link.
Yeah, and so Scott, maybe what might be helpful, because I have it. Let me grab it. I got two different, and yours doesn't allow me access for some reason.
Oh, that makes sense. But I can share that with you.
Yeah. Do you want to just share your screen?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's my fault.
Cool. So one of the things I want to have you all think about in kind of this last part of our conversation is your next steps as a board. Like, where do we go with this? So we say effective boards who lead for equity have an equity policy. So like, congratulations, you have an equity policy, right? You've done that. And many boards don't, by the way. I have a couple of clients we're working with now to help them develop a policy. So you have one already. And so I want you to always think about what the purpose of this policy is. And again, you have a lot of policies, right? Many that you may not even be aware of because, there's a lot. However, this policy you want to be aware of. This is your policy you keep kind of like next to you when you're at the dais, you're making decisions. This policy should really, again, be that lens for how you govern with all policy. Okay, that's the goal of what an equity policy is. It's not designed to just check the box and be done. So what I want to do is let's take a look at it. So Scott, if you want to pull it up, let's just look at a few components and think about a couple of notes you want to take around what is missing from there. And then also, what do you really like from your policy? And for some of you, it's just looking at it for the first time, again, in a while, right? I mean, obviously you looked at it for this study session, but remember, your policy is one that you want to have as a living, breathing document. Okay, so Scott, go ahead when you're ready. And let's see what pops up. All right, there it is. So does any of you want to just, because I know our community gets to watch too, and so just giving a little context, do any of you want to share, or even Scott, since you're sharing your screen, you want to share the history of your equity policy, just so everyone remembers how we got this policy?
Yes, so I will say that it's good that we're doing this deeper dive into it because it is the CSBA sample as is. And well, I guess it's a few years back now. Time goes by fast. We redid our whole policy handbook And so this was one of the samples in CSB that we adopted at that time. So, but it definitely is in need of some customization, given that it is, you know, the CSB example verbatim.
Right. Yeah. So board members, jump in. Scott's kind of reminding you of how you got to this place, and CSBA often gives samples, right? And you adopt them. It's not uncommon. But tell me a little bit about what you think about your equity policy so far. Tell me what you think of your policy so far. CSBA's policy is a good one. It's not a bad one, but I often say, like, let's massage it so it's ours, right? And some just leave it as is, which is fine.
So it's general enough so that it will work. And I'm going to guess a lawyer looked at it.
Yeah, usually CSBA puts out stuff that's vetted, so. But, so it's general enough. Anyone else want to share? How do you feel about your equity policy?
Well, like Phil said, I mean, it's general, and it's, you know, it's from CSBA. So, I mean, we basically approve what they have written, and I think it's basically what we believe in. But what always drives me nuts, and that's me, and I've said it before, is that the first sentence should always say, instead of the governing board, it should say Soquel Elementary School District believes that diversity, kind of personal. I think just that a first statement there would personalize it, and then you know, then would make it ours in a way where people would first read it. And if anybody reads our policies, especially our community, I mean, that's a statement in itself that this is what we believe in instead of the governing board. Got it.
No, spot on, Ted. Good catch. And I think that's where, can you envision that's where your equity statement gets inserted, and maybe I don't want to say remove per se, but those first couple of paragraphs maybe is more CSBA language, and you want to put your equity statement there. Does that sound about what you can envision?
The equity statement that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the part. Yep, that's it. That's
no, but
literally
it's our policy. We can do whatever we want with it, basically.
Yes, you can. yes, you can.
Could.
That's what I was thinking of. I'm sorry if I interrupt anyone. But just you want it to lead with a definition. How do we define equity?
Okay. Perfect. So we'll insert that. And I'm taking notes so I can send this back to you all. I just want you all to know. So this is why I'm asking these questions, because I have your statement notes, but I also want to make sure. So I think I hear you saying, let's just put our equity statement here, which you do say I think you say we are committed to. Does that make sense? This is where, so maybe take that first paragraph off, and then the second paragraph, which kind of is similar to your statement, where it's like your bullet points, right? That first and second paragraph, kind of, I think your statement really hits those. They're just in bullet points.
I mean, I think
the third, go ahead.
A lot of the things that we had in our own statement are kind of reflected here in ways that are definitely not fourth grade level reading level,
right?
But I think it's redundant, and I mean, whether that could still be fine if the language is a little bit simpler in ours, but a lot of it is, there's definitely just a direct relationship between what we wrote and also what's written here. So I think it for better or worse. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But it is similar, maybe in a way majority. But
if we were able to wordsmith right now, I could literally like take those off and put your statement in there, and I think it would really speak to, like, okay, this is what we believe equity is, and it makes more sense to you. And I think you simplifying it is fine. You may have noticed in some of the samples I sent you all, I don't know if you got to go through all of them, but there were some really interesting samples, and some of them are really simple. and some of them are more like complicated, right? You said it's not fourth grade language, but policies typically aren't. Those aren't designed for fourth graders to read, but they are definitely, you want it to be yours and you want it to make sense. And so, like Ted said, it's ours. We can do what we want to do to it, right? So you want to make sure the key components are there. So your statement would make sense. And so we removed the first two paragraphs. Would that make sense? So remove those first two and then insert your equity statement.
Our equity statement is racial equity, correct?
Correct.
And then this is titled equity. Would that make a difference? Because basically we're stating here equity for all, correct?
Well, actually, it's just student equity.
Or student equity, right?
Yeah, I think those details wouldn't change the essence of your policy. Like districts have an equity policy, right? If you want to call it your racial equity policy, I don't think it's an issue. Remember, they gave you the BP based on the numbers, and I think you all aligned yours, right, through your numbering process. So if you change the word from racial equity to racial equity, I'm not sure that makes a big difference. I think it's more about your board policy aligns with your numeric kind of alignment. So I think, I don't think that's a big issue. I think the content of your policy really needs to be more about, you say what equity is, right? You say what racial equity is, and that's your statement. And then what comes below that is more critical now. Is now, what is the board going to do? So the board shall, and this is where your BP kicks in. And then, of course, after that, you're going to have your ARs, right? As what the superintendent shall do, which is more about what are those actions that help implement your policy. Does that make sense? So those are those two components that I think are really critical. And part of those ARs, honestly, are going to be, I would imagine, would be influenced by what your task force is going to bring to you all. So often that is very much like aligned with what the task force does. So that's one piece. So I didn't expect us to do all the ARs tonight because that's a whole process, and I would never recommend doing it without really going through a process. But as far as your board policy for you as the board, I want you to take a look at some of the language beyond the second paragraph. So the board shall, that language, I want you to take a peek. And then Scott, are you able to scroll up a little bit more? I think there was a little bit more language under. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so see, I just called out what the board shall do. So think about what that looks like.
Stereotypical assumptions. And that's kind of what I brought up earlier too. You know, that's the last sentence right there.
Yep. Jessica did too. I think that's where she was coming from too, with the asset strength base versus stereotypes, which is more deficit thinking, right? So I think you have some alignment there.
So that last sentence, okay, so the board decision is not going to rely on our bias or our stereotypical assumptions. Is that what we're saying? Or is that how?
Yeah, this is calling out the board, what the board shall do. This is your policy that governs your decision making. So it is more about you, yes. And with these, I like making these bullet points because these big paragraphs kind of jumble things together. So that would be one thing I would recommend, is just bullet pointing. It's just something I like. So that it really sticks out. You can see there's like three sentences, I think. So it's almost like 3 bullet points that really help you think about when you make decisions, what we shall do. Like we're directing, this is our directive, right? This is our policy. So ensuring equity is an intentional result, making decisions with deliberate awareness. Those are all things to really call out how you make decisions. And it's pretty general, right? It's not putting you in a box. Pretty general, but it's being very specific about what that lens looks like as far as what you shall do. So how do y'all feel about that piece? You like it? Do you want to massage it? I kind of recommend 3 bullet points because it's a little bit easier to absorb and read and apply.
Yeah, I like the bullet points. I'm having trouble with the idea of of pulling out, just like yanking out paragraphs and the like, because I think when we considered this policy originally, we did put thought into it, but I generally I'm sort of wrapping my brain around the idea that our statement that we're working on is potentially kind of the what that goes at the top of the policy, and what's falling below is sort of our how.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm feeling right now, but I feel like we've gone slow to go fast, and now I'm in a race car and I'm scared.
So to me, it seems to me that our statement is a reiteration of the second paragraph. Am I wrong on that?
So typically the statement is something you start off with. It's like your why, right? Yeah. It's our why, it's our lens, right? By which we do all things. And so your board shall is really calling out more deliberate what the board shall do. Remember, the equity statement is a little bit more general, right? You want that to apply to everyone, right? Your principals should see that as their lens, right? You want your kids to see it as their lens, your parents. So it's very general what you believe, like you mentioned. But board shall is more specific about the board's actions.
Well, the second paragraph says the district shall, and that's us.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So yes, Scott, if you scroll down, I think where Phil is at is the
I'm talking about paragraph number 2. Paragraph number 2.
At the top?
Well, number 2, yeah. The second paragraph, it starts in order to eradicate.
Okay, yeah.
It says right in the middle, the district shall proactively, and all the stuff that's after that is what we have in our statement. So our statement pretty much repeats what this says.
So what we talked about earlier, Phil, was just was removing those first 2 paragraphs and putting your statement in that place. Does that make sense? So you're not those 2 paragraphs we would just eliminate and put your racial equity statement there.
Yeah, until a lawyer says we can't get sued for that. Okay.
It's your policy. I don't think that'll be an issue. You're literally, this language is sample language from CSBA, but what you're doing is you're making this your policy. And so if you take a look at other sample policies, again, I don't think there's a legal issue. It's more about this is what you envision as equity in your district. And what you shall do is where you really want to be clear about. What are we saying that our policy is going to state that the board shall do? And then, of course, below that, if you scroll down to the next page, that's when it begin to talk about what the superintendent, right? So now you're starting to go into the admin regulations, right? So that's where I think you do want to talk a little bit more about what your kind of legal spaces are, because those all correlate to other policies too.
Actually, it's not what the superintendent do. The very second word is it's the board will do these things.
Right. Well, you collectively work with your superintendent. So I think when you're looking at this is more about implementation. So the language, the board, and the superintendent or designee, right? So you make decisions. Your policy obviously is with your superintendent, but the implementation, number 1, number 2, number 3, those are all going to be connected to the actual actions of your superintendent and designees, right? Because you don't do the work. Does that make sense? That's the work that actually happens in terms of implementation.
But we have to.
Scott, do you want to jump in?
We have to create and maintain the framework.
Yeah, Scott, jump in. I think Scott can clarify too.
Well, I hope. So one thought that I had, and I wish I had it earlier, but sometimes it takes the discussion to get the gears rolling, is I wonder if it's an option after hearing this is to keep the board policy the same or relatively the same. And since we don't have an administrative regulation currently, to create an administrative regulation with maybe a little bit more freedom you know, to be a bit more, if I can use the word creative, with our own statement. I wonder if that's an approach to take that would feel not quite race car, but not quite sitting still.
Yeah. No, I think we're saying the same thing. I think one of the things that's nice is your task force, I think, helps influence some of that development of those admin regs. I think they help to inform some of that development. So I agree. I don't think this is not a day to do those kind of things. This is where you really want to just start with the high level. What does racial equity mean to us, and what should the board do? The more policy piece for the board, and then the ARs definitely need to be developed out. I totally agree. And sometimes people use the task force like you all have to influence those, and some don't. So I don't want to say that they're the ones who determine those. I'm not saying that at all, but they definitely sometimes can influence that conversation. So
yeah, we'll get lots of input for
that
sure.
makes sense.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I know we're at the end of our time, and I want to make sure, I know we had a little bit of a glitch in starting, so I want to honor your time as we are at the end, but I want to make sure as a board that one, you celebrate, you have an equity policy, right? So if you left this as is, it's a good policy, but I want to make sure that you all own this policy and that this is what you use to apply to your governance practices. So if you can envision this as we kind of close out, if you're at the dais, one day you're going to be back at the dais, believe it or not, right? And right now you're in your home dais, so that's fine. So if you can envision that every time you have a meeting, you obviously have your agenda and you've done your amazing homework of reading all your packets, but what do you have? You always have your policy sitting right there with you, because it is your reminder and it's your lens, which has your statement embedded in it. It has the reminder about how you make decisions around governance across your district. So your policy is like your lens for all policy. And if you have that sitting with you, that is always your reminder. And Amanda, I think you said it earlier really well. That's kind of the process. You have it in front of you. It is your guide. It is the way that you stay centered and focused on equity work. And it allows you not to be distracted by all the operational things that come with trying to run a district, which is very common for everyone. But that's the ultimate goal of your policy. And ultimately what it does too is, as your superintendent and designees that he has come to you with presentations, with information that you're going to need, that you have a way of asking questions to them, so that there is a very an equity-based culture of governing in your district, so that policies that you pass and that you adopt ultimately make an impact. And we talk about closing equity gaps. That's what that policy is so critical for. And I know you don't sit at the dais with every policy in front of you. That's a pretty big room to sit with you, right? Not even a binder, a room. But this policy is one you got to hold on to. If you really want to do equity work, you got to have something that's going to keep you focused. It's a post check. And I tell you, people are going to get used to the governance style you create, the culture you create around equity. And your policy is a great guide for that. So you all are kind of on your way already. You're actually ahead of many districts who haven't gotten to their policy yet. But part of why they haven't too is they want to establish and make sure it's their own. And so I think that's the work you can do moving forward. Although we're at the end of our study session time together, I encourage you, just like we did this year, we had 4. And I encourage you to commit to 4 study sessions that you all just commit to your equity work. Give yourself that time to learn together, to be with your staff, to look at data, to really unpack this, where you're not making any decisions, you're just discussing and learning, so you can really build capacity of wanting to lead this work through an equity lens. And don't rush yourself, take your time. It's a go slow to go fast process, but you got to commit to it or it won't happen. You got to commit to it. And so I want to appreciate all of you for engaging this year. I know we'll probably see you one more time when your task force comes. We want to make sure we're there to support in the process of them bringing their recommendations. They have one more meeting and may decide they may need more time or not. I don't know. And that's something that I think your board liaisons, you all can decide with them on what works, because you don't want to rush them either. But I think they've done phenomenal work, and just appreciate each of you for your vision, your passion for this work. And Scott, in ending, thank you for your vision as a superintendent. Always admire your leadership and without you knowing, I use you without saying your name. I use you as examples, and you're many a times about just the intentional focus on this work. That's a big deal. So I just honored to lock arms with you and your staff and your community as well. So thank you.
So with that, Nicole, I'm just, with this policy, I was glancing at the bylaws, but something like this should actually go into our bylaws. Do you think?
No, I think this is a little bit different, but I think your bylaws should.
Well, I think the last paragraph.
Yeah.
Basically, don't be a bigot jerk when you're, making which it should say. But,
well, there it is, right? Yeah, I think when you do your handbook, right? I think it's perfect. Yeah. No, I think when you do your handbook, this should all align for sure.
Okay.
So they're not separate, but yeah, the policy is not necessarily the bylaws, but everything should align, right? Like I think everything should align. It shouldn't be separate things going on. And that's why I love the priorities being such a powerful piece to kind of keep things together. So
as to be an equity district, I would ask the board to consider putting the equity statement in the employee handbook along with the harassment, drug-free, all that stuff that you have in there, that we have this equity statement too.
I think that's a good idea.
And I mean, I love your idea, Ted. I think it makes sense that it could be referred to in a way in the bylaws when we're done with the statement and the policy as well, kind of reflecting back and including it in our, guiding star that is our own handbook, that acknowledging that we've done the work and reminding ourselves to center it.
How about in the handbook?
Yes, and yes.
Okay. So, are we done with questions?
So. Thank you, board, for engaging in this work. Thank you, Nicole, for you will have a legacy in our school district that goes beyond the work with these board workshops. I think you have encouraged us to speak our truth. You have encouraged us to get uncomfortable in the way that will get us to where we need to keep going. So just thank you for your and for your passion.
And thank you for the new word for tonight, monolithic. Monolithic. I like how monolithic.
Monolithic.
I guess we're in the meeting. I'm sorry. Okay, so with that, where's my agenda? That's pretty much it. And so is there a motion to adjourn the meeting? I guess that's where we ended at, right?
Is there any public comment
on this? Thank you.
There is nothing on text.
I'm sorry.
Nothing on email.
There's my agenda.
Nothing on Zoom.
I move to adjourn.
Okay, all in favor? Oh, is there a second? I'm sorry.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to Dr. Shelley.
I will let her know. Yeah, this was a long night for her, so we agreed that we would tag team differently tonight. I will